Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the Wood of the Holly. And today I have a really special guest who comes from me across this little digital divide. Actually, he's not that far away. But this gentleman, well, I'm so excited finally, I say that finally, to have him on my show. He is, let me say this, a big time brainiac. He has written more books, received more fellowships, and sits on more academic chairs than I have time to talk about. He has made a lifetime, well, really a life's work of deep diving into South Asian history, colonialism, contemporary culture, and cinema, and has done really tremendous work about Mohandas Gandhi. His scholarship is not restricted to the fortunate few at UCLA, where he is a professor, but is also available through his YouTube channel. And most importantly, for the purposes of this show, we're here to talk about someone we both knew and admired, James Lawson. He passed away just last week at the age of 95. And I will say this to begin. If there was a Mount Rushmore for social justice, in my view, James Lawson would surely be on it. He mentored and led what I consider to be, at least in America, the greatest generation of nonviolent activists that include Martin Luther King, John Lewis, James Bevel, Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, and others. And he was at the point of the spear that really invented a decade, that being the 1960s. And so I am so happy to have him here, Vinay Lal, to talk about it. Welcome to A Rebel Without Applause. How are you?
Thank you, Bill. I'm fine, and pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. So, we had made a plan to do another show, and due to the technical challenges at the time, it didn't quite happen. But I think this is an appropriate moment on Juneteenth of all days to talk about someone we both knew, James Lawson. And I had forgotten a little bit, but there was this tremendously detailed and really excellent article about you in the LA Times the other day about your extended relationship with James Lawson. And just as a point of departure, I kind of want you to talk about that a little bit.
All right. Well, let me begin, in fact, with my recollection of our first meeting. So our first meeting was in 1998. And in fact, in the course of the last few days, I just happened to run across an article which was published in 1998. I really had no recollection of having seen that article before. It came out in a journal called Communalism Combat, and the article basically gave a report on a meeting that was held in the greater Los Angeles area in 1998 on the occasion of Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, which is October 2nd. So there were four of us at that panel. I do remember the panel, of course. I didn't remember the article. Reverend Lawson and myself and two other people, including Joseph Prabhu, who just passed away a couple of years ago during COVID. He was a professor of philosophy. And we had been gathered together to discuss the legacy of Mohandas Gandhi. So that was my first meeting with Reverend Lawson. And I have a very warm recollection of what he had said, because he had spoken about the importance of Gandhi for him and the importance of Gandhi's teachings for the world. Well, then we met maybe another 10, 15 years later. This was at a church in Pasadena. There's something called a Season for Nonviolence that was held in Los Angeles. And so at this church, it was just the two of us. We had a large audience of about 250, 300 people. And he spoke first, and then I followed up after that. And we spoke in our own different ways about what is the meaning of nonviolence. And I proposed to him that we do a little book of conversations. And he said, well, I'm intrigued by the idea, but I need to know a little bit more about what you really have in mind, what sort of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So I took him out to lunch at a restaurant in Westwood, an Italian restaurant, and we conversed for an hour and a half, and he said, I'm persuaded. I think you could do a decent job, uh, with this book. And so the first of our meetings was at the Holman Church, uh, a church where he was now already the emeritus pastor at this point. He'd been the pastor there for 3 decades, something like that. The church was, in a manner of speaking, his church.
Right.
Uh, Not only because he'd been the pastor for so long, but there's, one of the buildings is named after him. Long before he passed away, of course, a few days ago, and we met there, and it was, I think, just a week after the passing of Nelson Mandela that that we
Okay.
first met. Okay, and when we did, we started our conversation with our views about Nelson Mandela, and we both found ourselves in agreement on a point on which I think otherwise there would be quite a bit of disagreement, especially among scholars, and namely that and this is the view that I proposed, and then we talked about it, and he agreed with it, which is that Nelson Mandela is often put in that trajectory, if or line, if I may put it this way, which runs from Gandhi to Martin Luther King, and for those who are well versed in the history of the movement, not just King, but the other great stalwarts of the movement, because everyone in the civil rights movement was acquainted with the teachings of Gandhi. And not just acquainted in a casual sense, but they had studied Gandhi. John Lewis had studied him. Bernard Lafayette had done, Diane Nash. They had all studied Gandhi. And we know that Gandhi's texts were, among other works that were used by Reverend Lawson, um, in the basement of his church in Nashville when he
Nashville.
first did these nonviolent training workshops, right?
Right.
So, when and what was a point that Reverend Lawson and I agreed upon, which is that in South Africa, if I may put it this way, the pursuit of nonviolence uh, didn't take place in as rigorous a fashion as it did either in India or in the United States. So
Right.
anyhow, our first meeting then was in that in the basement of Holman, where we talked about Mandela and all of that, and then uh, um, um, we started talking about Reverend Lawson's childhood. Now, when I'd initially broached the idea, I had um, suggested to him 4 meetings, right? So I have about 27 hours of conversation with him. And during the course of this, we discussed uh, the civil rights movement. He never, by the way, liked to call it the American Civil Rights Movement.
Mhm.
Sometimes he called it the Rosa Parks King movement. There were other expressions that were used as well. But we talked about that. We talked about Gandhi. We talked about the idea of nonviolence. We talked about Black America, the condition of Black people. We talked about incarceration. We talked about American empire. Because he had an intellectual uh, appetite for a large number of things beyond the movement. I think most people knew him in the capacity of an active campaigner for social justice. We know that once that after the assassination of Martin King, that when he eventually relocated to Los Angeles, then he became involved in social movements over here, and people know, or at least some people know about his work with people in the working class. Uh, but beyond all of that, uh, uh, Lawson had and not simply an intellectual curiosity, he had an intellectual stake. That's very important. Intellectual, moral, and political stake in thinking about the United States. and its place in the world. And to impress upon you what I mean here, let me recall what Martin Luther King had said during the course of the war in one of his most famous speeches, when he said that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. These are almost exactly his words. Now, Lawson really did think that was a case, not just back in the 60s, but has been the case with the United States, for decades, down to the present day. And I think, again, that part of his critique of the US and all of that, I don't think that that has really been taken very seriously. He also coined this phrase, really, in a way, it's his phrase, plantation capitalism, as he called it, right? So I think that, the totality of our conversations was about a great many things, but you can see the links between all the subjects that we spoke about.
Well, to my mind, I was in the workshops and I wrote a screenplay about him in Nashville, and is that he really defied some of our stereotypes of the Southern preacher, the stem winder, Martin Luther King waxing poetic.
Yeah.
To me, he really, the image that I have as I wrote about him and as I got to know him was he was like a physics professor. He was a scientist. I mean, he was deeply imbued with these ideas in his soul. But when he shows up in Nashville, he has like this perfect laboratory to put these ideas to the test. And I think it was a spectacular success. Could they use these tools, follow this sort of disciplined playbook that had been laid out by Gandhi, and see if it works? By the way, maybe it wouldn't. Could in a country drenched in violence, nonviolence prevail? And it did. And so that's sort of the image that I have for him. And then when I sat in the Holman workshops, which were generally, I guess they were always the last Saturday of the month, I was so impressed by his vitality. He was already in his late 80s, maybe early 90s. He could stand up. I have some video of it, and really just talk for hours. And the thing that he said to me, or to all of us, was that nonviolence, or the Satyagraha, or this, is a discipline that is no less rigorous than if you were a Navy SEAL. That it takes preparation and work, and it's not just sticking daisies in gun barrels. It's researching, making demands, finding a creative space in whatever the exact situation. So, for example, in Nashville, Black people can purchase stuff downtown, but don't sit at the lunch counters.
Yeah.
So that might be a key to unlock bigger issues or larger issues of segregation in the whole thing. And so that was what was so fascinating and so dramatically interesting to me, as someone who writes screenplays, about Reverend Lawson. And just for me, and I just being in his presence, I felt like I was in the presence of somebody really great, like great. This is, we read about being in the presence of these giants or spiritually invested people. And I have to say that I felt that around him. And I'm just a guy from the Valley. So that's sort of my 2 cents about him,
You're absolutely right. You felt yourself in the midst of someone who, to use a very common word, exuded a kind of a greatness. There was an aura around him. Some people would say charisma. Certainly, charisma is a very complicated word, and so I, for the moment, I don't really want to use the word charisma, because all kinds of people have charisma, and that's not always for the better.
Exactly.
Sometimes it can be for the worse, right? So, for example, Adolf Hitler may have had charisma, and so I think we have to be aware of using words which, as I said, have a very complicated kind of a history. But there's no question that he had a that there was a kind of an aura around him, and he had this. Lawson had this wonderful laugh. So he'd say something and then he'd laugh, right? And he also had a kind of an appreciation of, irony. I would say, a great sense of humor about him. Uh, so it was, in that sense, a person who was quite unusual because it was a person of firm conviction, but this firm conviction also came with enormous amount of compassion, a sense of irony, intellectual curiosity, a capacity to absorb ideas and to think aloud, and to frankly engage anyone in a conversation. Now, why is that important before we move on to some other things that you had been hinting at? It's important because when we think of violence, see, we can think of violence and we can think of the reasons why from, let's say, my standpoint and the standpoint of Lawson. The gist of what I'm saying is this, that, see, when you commit violence, it's an epistemological problem too, because the person who's perpetrating violence is implicitly saying, I am in possession of the entire truth. Okay? I know best. And the violence is justified by the fact that I know better than you do, whatever it is that is in dispute. Okay? Now, the reason you have to have a conversation is you always have to entertain not just the possibility, but the certainty that in virtually all situations, you can never be entirely in possession of the entire truth. That the opposing side, it may be an iota of what they say may have a glimmer of truth in it, but there's something there always, because otherwise, what's the basis of trying to dialogue with someone who seems irrevocably opposed to you? And I think that when you look at the present conflict here, when you in Gaza, and when you look at the positions that people have adopted, you see precisely one problem. There is the fact that people really don't converse across the divide. I mean, there's some people who attempt to do that, but in general, people don't, because they just simply assume that their position is the only position really to adopt. And this is again where someone like Gandhi comes in, because Gandhi came from a cultural, religious, and intellectual milieu in which Jain philosophy was very important, right? And the Jains have a word for it. So Jainism, as you know, is a religion that goes back to around the same time as Buddhism. This is what we call the historical founder. I won't get into the complexities of thinking about how the Jains think about their religious founder of the faith, because they said that he's the last in the line, Mahavir, but he was a contemporary of the Buddha, the worldview that came out of Jainism. There are a couple of principles which were critically important. One of them was the idea of ahimsa, that is, not violence. But the one that I really want to speak to here in connection with what we're speaking about is the idea of what the Jains called anek anantavad, which is the many perspectiveness of reality. So there's a parable. In fact, actually, the parable is recorded as having taken place during the time of the Buddha as well. And this parable then circulates eventually in Europe, as in most folk tales which came out of India. Right? And there's a 19th century English poet. I forget his name. I think it's John Godfrey Sachs or something like that. It's called Six Blind Men and the Elephant. That these six blind men are asked to describe an elephant. Well, they're blind, so they've never seen an elephant. So one touches the tusk of the elephant, right? And says, "Oh, the elephant is like a spear." And one touches the tail and says the elephant is like a rope, etc., etc. And the parable argues that each is partially right and each is partially wrong. And you need all of these perspectives together to think about an elephant, right? Now, I think this is critically important when we're thinking about the idea of a conversation. Why are conversations critically so important? Why we must persist with them, and particularly across what seem to be insurmountable divides. Okay,
What I would say,
and I think,
go ahead. Well, what I would just say is, yeah, because we're in this incredibly fraught moment over just like you said, Gaza, and this what this discipline that you're talking about, in my view, takes practice. It's like nobody's born with it. My instinct very often in arguments is let's go or defeat rather than, well, what do you think? Why is this important to you? Or what's your truth? Or, I get what you're saying. I'm trying to understand what you're saying. There's like key phrases that you can use, tools to maybe try and break to me, it's like a tribal divide. It's my team, right or wrong, as opposed to the truth. It's a kind of tribal mentality. And well, I think Lawson, to a certain degree, was trying to build a discipline for that approach so that rather than going to the mattresses, all of the Godfather, maybe we can go to the coffee house and have a cup of tea and see where we actually might find some common ground. Like that actually takes
Brown.
practice, just like I like to train in
Yeah,
boxing. It takes a lot of practice, but
yeah,
the discipline of nonviolence or just this other sort of allied uh, process also to me
yeah.
you got to practice it just like the piano. So that's I just want to
Yeah, so
bring
so
it
that
down to
that
earth.
was I was going to get to that part of the story, so to speak,
Good.
uh, because one of the things you had said in your earlier set of remarks was that Lawson really went about the practice of nonviolence um, uh, as though it were a science. Okay, so now it's important to speak to that aspect of his thinking. Um, you use the word practice. I'll use another word as well, which is process. Okay, it's a process. Um, now, let's think of it this way. So let's first think of the most common objection to nonviolence. Okay, Lawson and I spoke about this for quite some time. The most common objection is taking, let's say, the illustration of the British in India, because, of course, that was the terrain where Gandhi worked, right? India was under British rule. And the objection, very simply, has been this that Gandhi was fortunate in that his opponents were civilized,
Right. British
that
laws.
he was lucky that his opponent was not Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, right, or some other kind of totalitarian despot, right? Because the objection is that had his opponent been the Nazis, uh, for example, or Stalin, or people of like mentality, uh, he would have been crushed. Nonviolence wouldn't have had remotely a chance. Now, Lawson and I talked about that, and both of us would sort of laugh because we'd heard this so often, and I can remember hearing this from my childhood, really. All
Mm-hmm.
right, and in India as well. I'm not just saying in the United States, but in India, where I spent, my teen years as well, many of my teen years. So um, let me respond to that, and then I'll move on to this whole question of thinking about nonviolent resistance and nonviolence as a science. And I also want to distinguish between nonviolent resistance and nonviolence as a way of being in the world. One of the few instances of successful resistance of any kind is actually the Rosenstrasse demonstration, okay, which was completely nonviolent, completely nonviolent. And there have been a couple of books that have been written about that. And I won't get into the details of it, but it essentially involved German women who were married to
The
Jewish men
Jewish men in Berlin. I
in
think that
Berlin,
right,
and the
right,
demonstration took place outside the Gestapo headquarters,
correct. Yeah, I'm
into
aware. Yeah.
Strasse Street, in recent years, where it took place. And scholars will tell you this was one of the few movements of resistance that really was successful and was a non-violent demonstration. But the most critical point is this. Now, if you're going to have a non-violent movement, you can't expect that it's going to begin in 1942 and then you expect real results. Okay, you have to think about how long it took in South Africa, how long it took particularly in India. It was built up over a period of time. It's a process. That's what's important to understand. Okay, and when we think about, so that brings me then to the related question of what you call practice and what Lawson describes as nonviolence as a kind of a science.
Hmm.
See, his view was, and I agree with that view, that what Gandhi did, what his real achievement was, to bring the idea and vocabulary of nonviolence into a common conversation for the first time in history. Okay? That he introduced a new vocabulary, a new grammar of nonviolence. Right? Now, what does it mean to think of it as a science? Okay, and what does it mean to think of it as a process? So, a nonviolent movement has to go through certain kinds of steps. Okay, you can't simply, because nonviolence is not simply the absence of violence. Let us be very clear about that.
Right.
Not taking up arms is not nonviolence. So, if for him, in a manner of speaking, India was never that perfect terrain where you could actually carry out the idea of nonviolent resistance. That's one reason why the possibility of a nonviolent struggle in the United States interested him. How do we know that it interested him? We know that from many circumstances, most of all from the fact that in 1936, when he was in his ashram in Sevagram, he is visited by Howard Thurman and his wife and two other African Americans. So it's, quote, a delegation of four African Americans. Howard Thurman, a great unsung hero of the 20th century. There's some theologians who know his work, but he was prolific. He wrote beautifully. Okay, 20, 30, 40 books. Howard Thurman, in his autobiography, has a whole chapter on his visit to South Asia. And of course, one of the reasons he was really animated to visit was because he wanted to meet with Gandhi, and he did. And this conversation they had is recorded both in his autobiography and in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. Right? And what was that conversation? The end of that conversation was Gandhi says to Thurman, in unequivocally clear terms, that it is very likely that the next great phase in the history of nonviolent struggle will be the struggle of your people for social and racial justice and equality. He didn't use the phrase racial justice because that's not a phrase that was used at that time. Of course, I'm just
Right.
paraphrasing. Gandhi said in 1936, right? So there are several considerations here. One is that in some ways you can think about the achievement of nonviolence in America as something that was greater, frankly, than what happened even in India. Uh, there are some reasons for that, uh, which I've been hinting at. One of them, of course, is that in India, the culture is extremely different. You also have an arms act. Ownership of arms was severely restricted. United States is a completely different proposition. I mean, here it's the worship of the gun. It's the worship of the gun, which has been going on for decades, for centuries, so to speak. Well, for 150 years at least. I mean, the whole genre of the Western is partially based on that. But even the South was awash with guns. And
Right.
I don't know if you know this episode, the story about when Bayard Rustin was first called to King's residence, and this is the Montgomery bus boycott before it
Right.
was launched. And John D'Amelio, in his masterful biography of Rustin, Lost Prophet, says that they decided that they would invite Rustin because Rustin had already been involved in nonviolent protests. In fact, he had done a freedom ride years before the Freedom
Or
Riders.
the core, well, the original one in 47.
Exactly, right? So Rustin is called in to advise. And remember, Rustin's not from the South. He's from the North, actually.
He's a Quaker.
And he's a Quaker. He's a Quaker, right? So he's from New York. He comes down, and Emilio tells us, John D'Amelio tells us that when he came to Martin King's home and he sat down on a sofa, he felt something, you know, something in his butt, something pinching him there.
Yeah.
And so he removes this cushion, and there's a couple of guns there. And says to Martin, what on earth are you doing with these guns? And you want me to train you or tutor you in ideas of nonviolence and talk about my experience? You got to get rid of these guns, Martin. And Martin King says to him, Bayard, you don't know what the South's like. Everyone's got to carry a gun here. And then Rustin told him, well, no, you've got to get rid of these guns if you're going to begin to think about nonviolence, right? Interesting story, but this is simply by way of suggesting that, as I said, that the circumstances and the American South and the United States generally were very different than what they were in India. This is apart from the fact that, of course, Black people here were a minority. Now, from Lawson's standpoint, you see, if you think of nonviolence as a kind of a science, so what does it mean? You can override all of these cultural, sociological contingencies, okay? Because his view was, when you have a movement, nonviolent movement, there are certain steps that you take. You proceed in a systematic fashion. So, for example, the first step is you say, we're going to actually inquire into what happened. We're going to collect all the facts, collect all the information. A lot of people who jump into this Gaza conflict with views, all right, and will start writing, fervently about this or that, about what's going to work, what's not going to work. Frankly, many of them don't even know the full circumstances on the ground. When I say full, of course, I mean, you can't know the full, but that is that you conduct an inquiry to the extent that is possible. Let's take an illustration. Again, go back to Gandhi, because that's what Lawson would do. Every time he wanted to illustrate the point, he'd go back to Gandhi because he had studied all of Gandhi's campaigns systematically, right? So at Champaran, before Gandhi becomes a world historical figure on the international stage, he comes back to India from South Africa in 1915, January 1915. In 1917, he leads what is really a local movement. Okay, it's going to be 1919 before he's going to be catapulted onto the national stage, because Gandhi also, in a sense, knew that he had to find constituencies. So there was a way in which he did that. But what happened in Champaran? Champaran, the word that I used a minute ago, this is a district in North India, in the state of Bihar. Okay, what is now the state of Bihar. So there were these indigo planters and peasants who used to work on these indigo plantations, right? And working conditions were extremely hard, right? Well, I won't get into the details of it.
Right.
So what does Gandhi do? He goes to that because he's invited by one of these indigo farmers who has heard of Gandhi and has heard of the work that he had done in South Africa, thinks that this man might be able to help us out. So Gandhi agrees to go to Champaran. But what does he do? For an entire month, he collects testimonies.
An inquiry.
He collects testimonies. He doesn't make demands. He doesn't immediately say, oh, we demand this from the administration. So before you make, quote, a demand, let's ascertain exactly what's happening. And Gandhi sits down patiently day after day, records hundreds of these testimonies, listens to what these indigo farmers have to say. Then he assesses them, right? And then he speaks to people on the opposite side. Right? There are all these steps that you have to take. And it's only after you've done all of that, then you get to the next phase of the struggle, right? And so similarly, when you think about what Lawson was doing in Nashville, so let's go to Lawson in Nashville. But the Nashville campaign, which Martin King would later on say was the first systematic campaign really, and nonviolent resistance in this country in that sense, following the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, at his workshops, Lawson, what did he do? So it's not only that they read Henry David Thoreau and Gandhi and Tolstoy and the Sermon on the Mount and a number of other people, right? They read these texts. If you read John Lewis's autobiography, he gives you a list of some of
Against
these
the Wind
works.
or With the Wind, the Wind.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Have
okay.
Yeah,
so he gives you a list of these. He's got about 2-3 page description of
right.
all of them. All right. But Lawson, in our conversations also mentioned the books that he read with the people who attended this workshop. And the people who attended this workshop were not only John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette and Diane Nash and James Bevel, but there were many others.
Marion Barry, Marion Barry, among others.
Marion Barry, yeah, who subsequently became the mayor of.
And white kids, and white kids too.
White kids. So I was about to get to that, and there were white kids, but they were predominantly also students from the neighboring black colleges and universities, right? Historically black colleges and universities in that area. Now, their part of the training was because Lawson had not only studied Gandhi, but he had read, obviously, and he had not only read, this was part of his inheritance. He had, as a preacher, as a pastor, as a Methodist minister, he had read the Bible, of course, and knew exactly what Jesus had said, that you have to be able to bear the suffering of others upon yourself. And you have to be able to, so to speak, take retaliation. Okay? So what was the training? He said, look, if we're going to desegregate these lunch counters, you should expect that you're going to have racists who are going to come and beat you up. They're going to throw ketchup in your face, and they're going to throw mustard, right? And they're going to humiliate you, mock you, laugh at you, and beat you. And you have to be able to take all of this. And he would actually enact this out. That's what was enacted out week after week. He's training you to be able to withstand that humiliation, okay, and think of it in a different way. Transform that humiliation into something else, right?
As a point of, just to interrupt or just inject, when I wrote those scenes, some of which were at the Highlander Folk School and other places, the thing that hit me as they literally would do, as I understood it, improvisations. They would play act these things. And it reminded me so much of my acting classes in New York, yeah. And all I could see was, in my mind's eye, was Lawson sitting there like Jack Garfine, who was a brilliant director and my acting teacher at the time, sitting there watching these improvs take place. It seemed to me like an acting class in a way, because they're using imaginary circumstances to create another reality, to practice for, of course, the real thing. So I just wanted to interject that,
no, wonderful. Yeah.
It's like, this is acting class. And sometimes people would get carried away. It could get carried away with the racist, the person who playing, the race baiter could get carried away, or the person who was abused. They had to really struggle to constrain themselves, and maybe they would react. And actually, that's what it was for, because you wanted to get that out of your system. You wanted to be corrected. You wanted Lawson, or whoever that moderator was, Lawson, really, to say, no, we're going to dial that back. You're going to breathe, and we're going to practice this moment so we can get it for the real thing.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
wanted to add that because my background also is I'm a stand-up comedian and an actor. And when I read those accounts, I said, "Oh my God, I can write this because
Right. Yes.
it's
Yeah.
acting class."
Yeah. Yeah. It resonated with you. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, yeah. So, anyhow, that was part of the training that the students who came to this workshop received, and as I said, it wasn't only reading the text, but it was this, and I think that they learned over the years. So the strategy of filling the jails, for example, so there's quite a lot of discussion in the civil rights literature about this particular strategy of filling the jails, and again something that happened in India. I don't know that, for example, one difference is I don't know that Gandhi ever really theorized it as such, but he was clearly aware of the fact that when certain actions were taken, there would be certain consequences, and repression would follow. And part of that repression was to haul thousands of people, as happened after the Salt March and the Salt Satyagraha, because the Salt March was part of that. What becomes a larger Salt Satyagraha? There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who were hauled into jails, and eventually many of them had to be released. And as you know, what happened here in the US was that people would be actually arrested, and then they would be taken to a place 50 miles away and just dropped there,
right.
Uh,
And I
you
want
know,
to just interject about that because,
uh,
in terms of Lawson's trajectory, for people that aren't as familiar, he did go to jail as a conscientious objector or some sort of a refusenik as a result of the Korean War. He also
that's
was
correct.
amongst the very first on the first bus to Parchman, or rather to would be Jackson from Montgomery to Jackson. Goes to he was amongst the first kids in, and he wasn't a kid. He was about 10 years older, I think,
Yeah,
at Parchman.
yeah,
There's a great picture of him in the back of the bus with the National Guard guy. He he was he was really at the very, I mean, he was the mentor, this kind of Lone Ranger figure, as I imagined him. But he was also at the point of the spear. And I much asked him once, I said, I've read all these books, and there's very little that describes your experience in Parchment. And he looked at me and said, yes, that's been very overlooked in all the literature. But yes, I was indeed there on the bus, and,
yeah,
you know, you, amongst the first to go to Parchment.
yeah. One of the great books on the movement, um, which does do Lawson quite a lot of justice. I mean, it has pages on him and on his role in mentoring, people like John Lewis, is David Halberstam's
The
The Children.
Children. Now, I might
Yeah,
add, I have the
yeah.
rights to that book. That's how
Oh,
I
you
got
do?
involved. I
Oh,
secured the cinema rights and to that
yeah,
book, and that was my
yeah,
point of departure in this journey
yeah,
was Halberstam's book, The Children. And
yeah,
Lawson told me, because we discussed it, he said that's the best book, at least about this corner.
yeah,
One of the problems with the
yeah,
book for me as a storyteller was Halberstam is sort of the master of the profile. He doesn't really put together the scenes for you, if you're trying to connect a narrative that could be
yeah,
a movie. But
yeah,
as you said, his description of those meetings in the basement and the
yeah,
Parchment experience, of course, just Halberstam was in Nashville. He was a young reporter there, and in earlier drafts of my screenplay, he was a character because he's sort of the witness from the Nashville Tennessean who's like,
yeah,
writing about this. One of the first time the white press, as you kind of inferred about this, is actually on this stuff. The black press had been on it for generations, but the white press had kind of like, I don't know, LA Times also, California Eagles doing these stories about Central Avenue and abuse. But the LA Times is like, well, I don't know, what do we know about that? So anyway, all this stuff is central to my own journey and frustration too. What can I say? And I went to these workshops because of
yeah,
Lawson's at Holman, because I couldn't imagine, well, first of all, when I discovered, wait a minute, this guy's right here. He's 5 minutes away or 10 minutes away from where I live in Hollywood Hills. I said, I can't write this and not go to these same workshops that he gave in the, in the basement in Nashville. I feel
Yes.
very privileged as an overprivileged white guy, honestly, to have had those experiences with him. I really feel grateful for him for that. This is so enlightening to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. But the Halberstam's book is a gripping read.
It
I,
is.
I know a lot of that literature, and there's really nothing like that book. It's a gripping read. When I first read it was just really actually only some years ago. I mean, after our conversations, I read it. I think a
Oh,
few years ago.
oh,
Yeah,
really?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I had known of the book, but had never read it, and then I pulled it down from my stacks and said, "Well, let me take a look." And frankly, I couldn't get away from that book. It's a gripping read. It's really well written. It's got some detail that you don't see in any other
Right,
work, and he had a sense for the whole thing. He could capture it. They're very important little things there, which again, and Lawson figures in that and the story I want to tell you here. And so, that there were some. Halberstam tells us that there were some people there in this closely knit group of friends and colleagues and activists who took the view that, look, Martin King didn't seem too eager to want to go to jail, that many of the others would say, hey, you have to be prepared to go to jail.
big
And
scene in the Freedom Rides in Montgomery.
yeah, yeah.
Golgotha
And
scene.
he
Yeah,
seemed to want to be able to, and Lawson says that then he had to come in between and say that, look, I mean, you must let him have the measure of things in his own way. There may be We shouldn't judge Martin for whether we think he's willing to take this burden of the cross of going to jail, as it were.
right.
Uh, and so so Halberstam has I think a very nuanced kind of description of what happened, and there I have to be really on Lawson's side again, because I've heard this. Even, of course, we know that one of King's most famous um documents, writings, is the letter from Birmingham jail. But
You know,
I'm saying in general, the supposition of many in the movement was that that he seemed to want to avoid jail, and so therefore, in a sense, he wasn't really tested in the way in which many of the others were. And I think Lawson's view there was, I would say, a more judicious view, that we should that he urged his friends and colleagues and fellow activists that don't be too judgmental about it. Think about what he's doing, what his role in the movement is, and he knows the measure of things himself. You know, so I think it's a very interesting description that you get in Halberstam's book. But there are lots of other things that he talks about too, but we won't get into right now, right? I
well,
mean,
I will say once that first that it's not like everybody who heard his speeches about Lawson talk about nonviolence immediately embraced it. Bevel,
yeah,
as I understood it, and as I read and I got into it and I thought about it and later imagined it, he was very skeptical about what are you talking about? Nonviolence.
yeah,
This is are you crazy? Medgar Evers, you keep a shotgun by the door, okay? You're nice.
yeah,
You keep a shotgun by the door. Not unlike these are the. I don't think his idea. It actually took some persuasiveness. It wasn't just like they got the Sermon from the Mount and accepted it. There was some hesitation about this. After all, our story in America, all of our victories, our so-called social justice victories, were seemingly won at the point of a spear or a rifle, whether it was Bunker Hill or Iwo Jima or the sands of Normandy. All of our so-called liberties were seemingly purchased at the point of a gun. At least that's the narrative. And Lawson and people like Zinn, they start to offer, no, well, wait a minute. There's like a different story here. Maybe we're missing.
yes,
I'm sure Lawson talked to you about the Revolutionary War and sort of some of the nonviolence that really precipitated
yes,
that as well. It was very important when he spoke about it. I remember hearing that. Uh, Another thing about is that what Halberstam described quite well was the differences within the African American community, the generational differences, the ideas about what the hell is Diane Nash doing in charge here. Come on, this is for the guy like Foreman. Who is the? They want to talk to me, not no. We want to talk to Diane. Some of the sexist attitudes, and then just the class issues within the Black community, like the kids that were going to Fisk were, the talented 10th. The kids that were at ABT, American Baptist Theological Seminary, basically maybe studying to be small town preachers. And so I thought that
Yes,
Halberstam really painted a very nuanced picture of
yes,
that world. That
yes,
was,
yes.
blew
Yeah.
my mind when I read it.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, I think it's a very powerful book. I mean, there's some things there that that he could have gotten into more detail. So, which I had gotten into, but as I said, I read Halberstam, after my conversations with Lawson had concluded. So, for example, one of the things that I had asked Lawson about, I put it to him this way. I said that, look, I've studied the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa as well. I've written a long article, for example, that came out a decade ago on Mandela and Luthuli, and how Mandela, in a manner of speaking, abandoned the path that Luthuli had set out. Um, and I said that one of the things that strikes me is that in the United States, there were disproportionately large number of churchmen uh, who were involved, especially in positions of leadership. Martin King being an obvious example, Lawson himself, a person that very few people except the specialists really even talk about, Reverend Charles Shuttleworth, who was a majestic figure. Okay. Um, uh, uh, but literally dozens of others. I mean, think about it. Now, that was
Vivian,
not the
C.T. Vivian. Yeah.
of course, yeah, yeah, many others, right? James Farmer, for example, right?
Yeah.
Rustin is kind of almost an exception in a way, if you ask me. That he's among those who's not really coming from, a background as a minister or preacher or pastor, um, and I said that that was really not the case in South Africa. Uh, so, and of course, I understood some of the reasons why that was not the case in South Africa. In South Africa, in the anti-apartheid struggle, just to mention one, I'm not saying this is the most important, but someone who studied the Indian diaspora for a long time, there was a significant number of Indians, for example, in the movement too. Dadu, for example, Ahmed Kathrada, very close to Nelson Mandela, I would say. Ahmed Kathrada has to be one of the three or four people who was the closest to Mandela and was with him on Robben Island. Fatima Mir. If I think about the Indians, none of them are Christian, of course. But even among the Black leaders, very few really came from a church background as such. Okay. Walter Sisulu, Mandela, none of them did. So I said, how would you think about it? And the U.S. in the American South, it was very different. And he said, well, there are lots of things we'd have to think about. But he said that, one place where Black people could meet, okay, without being infiltrated was, he said, the church. The church. Okay. This is the kind of thing that Halberstam doesn't really pick up on, if I may put it this way, that he could have spent more time reflecting on this, ruminating about it, because then, of course, you also get into questions of class and gender. That you don't really hear about the women. I mean, you hear about Rosa Parks, okay, and that moment. And of course, Rosa Parks didn't come out of the blue. She was a trained,
Right.
social activist. Um,
Highland
uh,
Folk School, or I think she was at Highlander
yeah,
Folk School. Yeah.
yeah, but she was also a member of the NAACP
Right.
and all of that.
She was prepared and trained.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, but that was not how the story of Rosa Parks was told or is told generally. I think that's now changed. It was just like ordinary woman who just took a
Sort of,
seat bus
yeah,
and
immaculately conceived kind of a moment, Yeah.
right, right. But even today, I think that, when you think about the question of gender and the civil rights movement, I mean, the name that comes to mind is Rosa Parks. Very few people are aware of Fannie Lou Baker or Polly Murray, for example.
Mm.
Polly Murray is such a fascinating figure, if you ask me. And again, she's quite active already in the 50s, in the late 50s, right? So, but the questions of, these churchmen, and then what was the role of women in the movement? Was there sexism? I think that Lawson and I spoke about it, and he said there was no question that there was some degree of sexism within the movement as well. Um, um, of course, Diane Nash comes to mind, but he told me, and Halberstam mentions that very clearly, that there was a lot of competition for her.
They were all in love with her, and she wasn't even Southern. She was from Chicago. One of the more interesting sort of things in that whole thing is Diane's troubled and difficult relationship with, to
With
me, was
Bevel.
yes, who's by far the most charismatic and conflicted, and
Yeah.
ultimately, although well beyond the boundaries of my story, tragic figures. But he is in himself a very charismatic genius of the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And he had extraordinarily complicated and troubled life long after the
Right.
end of the and if you I'm
Yes,
sure you know that. Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
aware of that. And it's quite, it's not worth mentioning, but it's tragic.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but
yeah.
he was a character. He loved women, and he was out there, and he's just, that's my movie star. If you're writing, and if you, I know you love cinema, so he's the guy that chose the scenery for me when I got into that story. And I just, one anecdote that I loved that Halberstam described with Lawson was he was a great athlete, and actually he was a physical education instructor from what I read, and when he went to India.
India.
Yeah, and
Yes.
there's this description of him playing football uh,
Yeah.
at Vanderbilt. He's there as a divinity student, and I can just, I saw him. Like you said, he had tremendous stamina. You could see that he loved. He was an athlete, and this image of him just. I wrote it and I had to cut it because you can't do everything, but just him playing football on the lawn at Nashville and just pulverizing these white frat boys. He's nonviolent, but he can block and tackle and deliver some punishment within the boundaries of sport. I love that about him, and I did have a conversation with him once because we were talking about collective things and this tension between individuals and the collective. We live with that in our own society. And I said there was no more vivid example of that than like the problem Kobe Bryant was having with the Lakers, because he was a star, yet he can't succeed without living within the collective of the team. And I do recall Lawson just really, it was one of the one times I felt like he really opened up to me in a way that maybe he hadn't before, because I guess he read the sports pages and was thinking about those things too. So he was a full person. I certainly didn't know the full dimension of who he was. He had a big family, uh, and I just sad to see him go. What can I say? We're lucky
Yes.
for
Well, I'll just tell you, maybe, as we move towards the end of our towards the end of our conversation, perhaps, but I'll tell you one anecdote which is not related in Halberstam, because he didn't really talk to Lawson that much about his years in India,
him.
and
Hmm.
this is related to Lawson's athletic abilities. So, as you rightly pointed out, he went to India. In fact, he's the only American civil rights leader to have lived in India. Many of them visited India. King himself went in 1959. Bayard Rustin went on a number of occasions. But Lawson lived in India, in the city of Nagpur in central India, not that far from Gandhi's last main ashram, Sevagram. And he was there from 1953 to 56. He went there as a Methodist minister, but he went there to coach. Uh, uh,
Yeah.
uh, uh, track and field, or and basketball at Hislop College. Okay, respected college, Hislop College. Um, and what Lawson told me was we had a discussion about his years in India, and he told me that so they were one evening the boys there in the college were playing cricket, uh, and uh, Lawson had never played cricket. Of course, he knew baseball. In India, they had no knowledge of baseball, none whatsoever. Um, so Lawson, said, "Well, let me take a hand. Let me take a stab at this. Let me try my hand at cricket." So he walks up to the crease, as it's called, and the first ball is pitched to him, and he whacks it for a six. So that's a maximum you can get. A six is when the ball doesn't even touch the ground when you hit it and goes way over the field.
Yeah.
It's like a home run, and in baseball. And he says that they all looked at him absolutely astounded because they said, "You sure, Reverend, you've never played cricket before?" I said, Never played cricket before, never touched a bat really." Um, and so, lo and behold, he was in a way almost starting to coach him in cricket too. you know. So he narrated this and his years and his slop. Um, I recently had someone uh, whom I've never met, but someone who was a friend of a friend who teaches at his college. So I said, I want you to ransack their library and see if you can find anything on, on
Yeah.
from. So he did find a couple of references in one of the annual yearbooks to Lawson there, but couldn't find any pictures of those years. Yeah.
Well, the pictures that you have of him as a young man, or that I've seen, and there's quite a few, he was also, I mean, right up to the last few years of his life, an extremely handsome person.
Handsome. Yes. Yes.
Very handsome, movie star handsome. Um, and, he just, it was all part of it. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really appreciate you to help shed the light on this person. I don't think the full meaning of his life is anywhere nearly been appreciated in the larger American story, but it's important. I don't think a lot of what we take for granted happens without him. He's kind of a quiet lone ranger, an avatar for these ideas. And
It was always a pleasure and, of course, a privilege to be with him. And he left a lasting impression on everyone.
and he'd slipped under the radar of American celebrity, which can happen.
Perhaps for the better. I mean, he never strove for a celebrity.
No.
I mean, he did what he had to do. He worked away quietly, lived a very modest life, and I think, yeah. I mean, it's extremely unfortunate that he's not better known. But if he had been better known, there was always a risk that you then become part of that celebrity culture that has other consequences.
Right.
And I think people like him don't worry too much about whether they're going to be known to others. And I don't worry about it, frankly, either, because he lived a very good life, and he lived a life which will be etched in the memory of those who know him, and will be etched in the memory of humankind. And
Yeah.
I think that's,
Yeah. And he
yeah,
didn't suffer for lack of
no,
recognition. It
no.
was not a point. Although will say, just to repeat, he said, "Yeah, nobody ever wrote about it. That I went to Parchment too." He was like, "I was there." Um, but
Yeah,
he did not suffer, in my view, because he was beloved in his time and in his community, within his family.
yeah, yeah,
And one of the things about nonviolence is it doesn't necessarily protect you from violence. But he
yeah.
managed to get through 95 years without
Yes,
all
yes.
that. So,
Yeah.
Vinay, great seeing you. And stay with me on the other side when I sign off. But to everybody, read more about James Lawson. If you're interested, you can reach out to me and read my script, Satyagraha in America, A True Love Story. Vinay, thanks for your scholarship, your input, and your friendship. Folks, till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha. Dig it, daddy-o.
Thank you, Bill.